In this tutorial, we'll complete a real-world implementation of touch panel button feedback. Let's just start with providing feedback for status of our digital I/Os using the feedback channel we discussed in the previous tutorial. Let's say, for example, you have a beam breaker sensor connected to an air wall in a divisible room. To better visualize how this will work, let's take a look at this diagram. As you can see, the beam breaker is simply wired with two conductors back to the I/O port on the back of the controller. One conductor is wired to the common, and the second conductor is wired to input number 8. Why 8? We'll be using the other I/Os for a future tutorial. Now, when the room is combined into a single room, i.e. the air wall is open, that air wall will trigger the beam breaker sensor, which sends an open circuit to the digital I/O connected to that sensor, which turns off that I/O channel. When the air wall is closed and the rooms are divided, the sensor creates a closed circuit and the digital I/O generates an on event, and the rooms are now considered to be divided. To see this work in the AMX system, we first need to create a touch panel button which will indicate the status of the room, either combined or divided. Let's open up our touch panel file in TPDesign 5 and create a new button. To open the file, just double-click on it in the workspace in NetLink Studio. Since we'll just add one more button to the Relays page, open the Relays pop-up page. Now, for efficiency, just copy and paste the Pulse button from the Relays exercise. The first thing we'll do is change the label of the button so it indicates combined or divided. Select your new button and go to the States tab in the Properties window. Now choose Off as a state to edit. Go down to the text field and change the word Pulse to say Rooms Combined. Next, go to the On state and change the text to say Divided Room. Next, we need to assign the appropriate port and channel code numbers to our button. Go to the Programming tab in the Properties window. Since the old Pulse button was already assigned to port 1, we can leave that, but we do need to change the channel code from 303. Since the 400 range is not used, let's assign 401 in the channel code field. Go ahead and save the panel file and close TPD5. We can now write the code to manage our air wall. Before we get started, let's be absolutely sure we are working in the correct source code file. Keep in mind, we have two different source code files. One is our lab master source, and the other is the P1 exercises source code. Prior to this lesson, you were working on an exercise in the P1 exercises code. So, let's close down all source code files that may be open and open up the lab master source code file. Let's start in Define Device. As you can see, we already have DVTP defined on port 1, so we don't need any additional TP devices defined. However, since we have not yet defined the digital I/Os, let's do that now. Right below the relay definition, create a new device and call it DV Digital I/O. Now, we assign the device number of the controller, 5001, colon, the port number of the I/Os is 22, colon, and the system number is 0. Next, we move on to the define constant. Let's add a blank line right below screen preset and add the digital I/O channel number for our beam breaker laser beam. I'll call it beam breaker. If you remember from earlier, we wired the beam breaker to input 8, so just assign an 8 to the constant. Here we'll add a constant for the status button we created. I'll call this button Room Combined Button, and remember, we used channel code 401 for that button. Let's move on down to the Define Events section, and just below the button event for the preset button, we're going to add a channel event for the beam breaker I/O. The channel event occurs anytime the state of a channel changes for any native Netlinks device. Just keep in mind that the event only occurs once, each time the state changes. For example, if our air wall gets opened and the beam breaker creates an open circuit on input 8 of the controller, that on event only happens once, regardless of how long the air wall is left open. So, to write the event handler, we just create a channel event, and for the device, we use DV digital I/O. And for the channel number, we'll use the constant for I/O number 8 we created a minute ago called beam breaker. Let's handle the on event first by writing the on event handler. Within the on event, we need to update the feedback to our room combined button by setting the state of the button to on. Likewise, we'll set the state of the button to off in the off event handler, like so. This first feedback method is using a channel event to update the status of our air wall buttons. It's important to mention here that this touch panel button we created is only for providing feedback to the end user. Pressing this button does not actually do anything. The second method that can be used in this scenario is to simply write single-line feedback in the Define Program section of code. While this method is simple and efficient, there are some limitations for its use, and improper use of Define Program can cause excessive CPU usage. For more detailed information on what causes Define Program to run, please give TechNote 993 a thorough read. Much later on in this course, we'll be teaching a much more efficient way to handle feedback, and the Define Program section will be left empty. Let's continue. Before we start writing the feedback in Define Program, though, we must comment out the feedback statements in the channel event that we just wrote. The reason for this is one mistake you never want to make is providing button feedback for the same button in two places in your code. This will cause the two feedback mechanisms to start fighting each other. So inside Define Program, since we always assign from left to right, we place the button we want to affect on the left side, then use the gets assignment operator. On the right side of the operator, we place the devchan pair whose value will get assigned to the button on the right. That line of code is written as dvtp, room combined button, gets, dv digital I/O, beam breaker. As you can see from the code here, this is easier and much less typing than using the channel event. As I mentioned, in a later exercise, we'll show a third method of using button feedback by creating a timeline. Now it's time for you to practice writing some feedback of your own.